Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The house was quiet, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound filling the space as I settled onto my couch, curling my fingers around the stem of a half-filled wine glass, my body finally beginning to relax after a long, exhausting day. The warm glow of the lamp beside me cast flickering shadows against the walls, the kind of dim, cozy light that made everything feel softer, easier, like the world had finally slowed down for just a moment. Like I could finally breathe without the weight of responsibility pressing against my chest. I had spent the entire week buried in work, dealing with never-ending client demands, managing deadlines that seemed to pile up faster than I could clear them, navigating the exhausting chaos of my own life while still making sure my parents had everything they needed. For years, I had been their financial safety net, their lifeline, the person who made sure they never had to struggle, never had to worry, never had to feel the crushing weight of overdue bills or unexpected expenses. And I had never once complained. Never once thrown it in their faces. Never once asked for anything in return. So when my phone rang, my father's name flashing across the screen, I didn't hesitate before answering, didn't even consider letting it go to voicemail, because this was how it had always been. I answered when they called, no matter how tired I was. No matter how much of myself I had already given away. "Hey, Dad," I said, my voice soft, warm, easy, the way it had always been with him. But before I could say another word, before he even realized that the call had connected, I heard it. His voice. Sharp, irritated, filled with the kind of biting resentment I had never imagined would be directed at me. "She's a failure," he scoffed, his voice clear, unfiltered, unburdened by even a trace of hesitation. "She'll never succeed, no matter how much money she makes." My breath caught in my throat, my fingers tightening around the phone as something in my chest twisted so violently I thought I might be sick. I should have said something. I should have made a sound, cleared my throat, let him know he wasn't alone, let him know I had heard every single word. But instead, I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. There was a soft chuckle in the background, someone agreeing with him, and then, as if he hadn't just ripped my entire world apart in a matter of seconds, he kept going. "I never even wanted her," he muttered, his voice lower now, but no less venomous. "She's a mistake that should have never happened." A mistake. A failure. A burden he had been forced to carry. The words settled into my skin like ice, numbing everything, freezing me in place, locking me into that moment with nowhere to escape. For my entire life, I had believed, deep down, that despite everything, my father had loved me. He wasn't perfect, wasn't always kind, wasn't always present in the ways I had needed him to be, but I had convinced myself that I mattered to him, that I had a place in his heart, that even if he didn't say it often, he was still proud of me. But I had been wrong. So unbelievably, heartbreakingly wrong. I had spent years carrying them, making sure they never went without, making sure they had a home, making sure their bills were paid, making sure they were taken care of, while he sat there, in the comfort of a life I had provided for him, telling someone else that he had never even wanted me. I had paid for everything. And still, it hadn't been enough. A mistake. A failure. A daughter who had never been worth loving. Slowly, without thinking, without feeling, without breathing, I moved my finger over the screen and ended the call, staring at the blackness of my phone, at my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and silent. The weight of his words pressing into my chest like a crushing, suffocating force. I could hear the faint clinking of ice settling into my now-forgotten glass of wine, could feel the slight tremble in my hands as I set my phone down beside me, could sense the strange, hollow emptiness that had begun to spread through my entire body, numbing me from the inside out. And then, for the first time in my life, I saw the truth. My father had never loved me, had never wanted me, had never cared about me in the way a parent should care for their child. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I had to do. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the sting of betrayal settle into something colder, sharper, something that no longer burned but cut instead, something that wasn't grief, wasn't heartbreak, wasn't sadness, it was clarity. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to demand an explanation from a man who had already told me everything I needed to know. Instead, I was going to smile, pretend nothing had changed, pretend I hadn't heard a single word. And then, when he least expected it, I was going to give him the ultimate surprise. I sat at my kitchen table the morning after the call, staring at the list of automated payments on my banking app, my coffee untouched, my mind completely blank except for the sharp, unforgiving echo of my father's voice playing over and over again in my head. I had been a failure, a mistake, a child that should have never been born, a burden he had been forced to endure despite all the years I had spent making sure he never had to struggle. I had taken care of them, sacrificed for them, given them everything I had without hesitation, without expecting gratitude, without ever once demanding recognition, because that was what family did, wasn't it? You gave, and you gave, and you gave, and you told yourself that love didn't need to be spoken to be real, that as long as you kept showing up, as long as you kept proving your worth, eventually, they would see you. But my father had never seen me. He had only seen what I could do for him. And now? Now, he was about to see what it felt like to lose me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the long list of scheduled transactions, the payments I had been making for years without a second thought, the bills that had never been my responsibility but had somehow become my burden alone. The mortgage? Cancelled. The utilities? Cancelled. The car insurance? Cancelled. The medical expenses, the credit card payments, the emergency fund transfers, the never-ending stream of financial support that had kept my parents comfortable while I worked myself to exhaustion just to keep up? All gone. I moved through the process with methodical precision, clicking each cancellation without hesitation, without regret, without a single shred of doubt. There were no second thoughts, no guilt weighing down my actions, no tiny voice in the back of my mind whispering that I was being cruel, because cruelty would have been pretending that I was still willing to pay for the life of a man who wished I had never existed. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold, the sun had fully risen, and the weight I had been carrying for years had finally started to lift. For an entire week, there was silence. No calls, no messages, no sudden, frantic attempts to reach me. At first, I thought maybe they hadn't noticed, that maybe Jason, the ever-absent golden child who had somehow remained their favorite despite never once lifting a finger to help them, had stepped in to cover what I had taken away. But I knew my brother, knew the way he operated, knew that his loyalty to our parents only extended as far as his convenience, knew that if there was even the slightest chance that helping them would put a strain on his finances, he would pretend he hadn't heard a thing. And I was right. Because by the 8th day, the panic began. My phone rang just as I was finishing up a report for work, the name Mom flashing across the screen, her number one I had never ignored, one I had always answered without fail. But this time I let it ring, let it go to voicemail, let the weight of her growing anxiety settle in as she realized, for the first time in her life, that I wasn't going to save them. An hour later, the voicemail notification popped up, her voice hushed, careful, filled with forced patience as if she thought she could coax me into changing my mind. "Hey, sweetheart," she started, the false warmth in her tone so painfully obvious I almost laughed. "I think there's been some kind of mix-up. Your father and I tried to pay the mortgage this morning, but the payment didn't go through. And then, well, we checked the utilities, and, there seems to be a little issue there too. It's probably just a banking error, but if you could check on that, we'd really appreciate it." I didn't check on it. I didn't respond. And by that evening, the calls really started. By the second day, she had dropped the soft approach. "Natalie," she said, her voice sharper now, more clipped, more demanding. "I don't know what's going on, but your father is getting upset, and I really need you to call me back. This isn't funny. We have bills to pay. You know that." "Do I?" I wanted to say, my fingers twitching over the keyboard, itching to type out the words, to remind her that I had been the one paying those bills for years, that she and my father had built their entire comfortable, debt-free existence on my money. That the only reason they had been able to look down on me for so long was because I had been too blind to see the way they were using me. But I didn't say anything. I just waited. And then, finally, on the 9th day, he called. I saw his name on my screen, felt the familiar instinct to answer immediately, to give him the respect he had never given me, to prove, one last time, that I was a daughter worth loving. But I didn't need his love anymore. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, my voice calm, even, completely unaffected. Hello? There was silence for a second, as if he wasn't expecting me to actually answer, as if he had already prepared himself for another ignored call, another unreturned message. And then, finally, he spoke. "Natalie," he said, his voice low, laced with irritation, but also, for the first time, something else, something that sounded dangerously close to fear. "What's going on?" he demanded, his tone sharp, authoritative, as if he still thought he had some kind of power over me, as if he still believed that he could talk to me the same way he always had and expect me to fall back into line. "Your mother told me the bills aren't going through. Did you forget to send the money this month?" I smiled, leaning back in my chair, letting a slow, deliberate breath fill my lungs, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. And then I ended it with a single text. "Figure it out." I pressed send and set my phone down, watching as another call came through almost immediately, watching as my father, for the first time in his life, realized that I wasn't his problem solver anymore. And God, did it feel good. It took less than 2 weeks for everything to start falling apart. I could imagine it happening in real time, could see the moment the first overdue notice landed in the mailbox, my mother opening it with her usual absent-minded hum, fully expecting it to be just another routine bill she didn't have to worry about because she believed, with complete certainty, that I would take care of it like I always did. I could picture the way her hands must have frozen mid-motion, the way her eyes must have widened as she reread the past due statement, the way her stomach must have dropped when she checked her bank account and realized that there was no magical deposit from her daughter to make it all disappear. Because for the first time in years, she and my father were going to have to figure it out on their own. I had expected a slow unraveling, maybe a few more days of silence, maybe another carefully worded text from my mother pretending she wasn't panicking yet, but instead, it all happened faster than I could have imagined. The second week, I started getting messages from their bank, automated alerts they must have forgotten were still linked to my email. Mortgage payment failed. Immediate action required. Overdue balance on credit card ending in 3087. Please submit payment. Final warning, utilities scheduled for disconnection. Each notification that came in felt like a quiet, satisfying reminder that they were finally feeling it, the absence of me, the absence of my money, the absence of their ability to pretend they had never needed me. And I waited. I didn't answer the texts. I didn't return the missed calls. I didn't acknowledge the growing desperation creeping into their messages. Then, one evening, just as I was getting ready to head to bed, my phone vibrated on my nightstand, a voicemail notification popping up on my screen, my mother's name attached to it. I hesitated for a second before pressing play. "Natalie," she started, her voice shaky, uncertain, carefully measured in a way that told me she had rehearsed this before calling. I just wanted to talk. I don't know what's going on, sweetheart, but your father and we're in trouble. The house payment didn't go through, and the credit cards keep declining, and I know there must be some kind of misunderstanding because you wouldn't just cut us off like this." I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of that sentence. Because she still didn't get it. She still thought this was some kind of mistake. She still thought I owed them something. And then, just as I was about to delete the message, her voice dropped lower, quieter, softer, like she was trying to sound broken, trying to sound remorseful, trying to make me believe she was the one who had been wronged in all of this. "Your father didn't mean it, Natalie," she whispered, like that sentence was supposed to erase everything, Like those words were supposed to stitch together the open wound that had been festering since the night I heard him call me a failure. He was upset, you know how he gets. He's stressed, honey. He loves you. You know that, don't you? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still, forcing myself not to throw my phone across the room, not to scream at the sheer ridiculousness of it all, not to let the anger clawing at my throat consume me completely. I had spent my entire life believing that love was something I had to earn. That if I just worked harder, if I just did more, if I just kept giving, eventually, they would love me the way I had always wanted to be loved. But that wasn't love. That was control. And I wasn't playing their game anymore. I deleted the voicemail without responding, knowing that the silence would be louder than anything I could possibly say. But my father? He wasn't built for silence. And by the end of the third week, he finally cracked. It started with a single missed call, then another, until my phone was lighting up every few hours with his name flashing across the screen, the urgency in his messages escalating with every unanswered attempt. Then, finally, the call I had been waiting for. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice steady, my tone completely neutral, like I hadn't been expecting this at all. "Natalie," my father said, his voice different now, lower, strained, carrying a tension I had never heard before. There was no barking demand for answers, no cold authority in his tone, no arrogant assumption that I would jump to fix whatever problem he had. For the first time in my life, he sounded small. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight, clipped, but I could hear it, the thing he would never say out loud, the thing he was choking on, the thing he was trying so hard to keep buried beneath his pride. He was asking for help. I let the silence stretch between us, let him feel it, let him sit in the discomfort of needing me in a way he never had before. And then, finally, I exhaled, slow and deliberate, like I was thinking it over, like I hadn't already made my decision days ago. "Okay, Dad," I said, keeping my voice light, keeping my tone easy, keeping my amusement carefully hidden beneath a layer of detached politeness. "I'll come by tomorrow." I could hear the relief in his exhale, could almost feel him convincing himself that he had won, that I was coming over to make things right, that I was still the daughter he could manipulate into cleaning up his messes. But he had no idea what was coming. Because I wasn't coming over to help. I was coming over to watch his world fall apart. The next afternoon, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, the one I had been paying for without a second thought for years, the one that had remained warm and comfortable because of my hard-earned money, the one they had taken for granted as if it had been theirs all along. But now it wasn't warm anymore. Now it wasn't comfortable. Now it was just another house with unpaid bills, with final notices stuffed into the mailbox, with desperation thick in the air. I stepped out of my car slowly, taking in the overgrown grass, the dark windows, the way everything suddenly looked smaller, emptier, like the house itself had started to reflect the state of the people inside it. I had grown up in this house, spent years walking through the same front door, sat at the same dinner table where my father had once made me believe I was loved, but now I felt nothing. I knocked once, not bothering to wait before pushing the door open, the familiar creak echoing through the quiet space, the smell of stale coffee and uneaten food lingering in the air. The house was dim, the curtains half-drawn, the furniture eerily still, like life had slowly drained out of it over the past few weeks, like without me, it had started to collapse in on itself. And then I saw him. My father sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his entire body radiating a kind of weariness I had never seen before. He looked older, smaller, like the man who had once towered over me with sharp words and cold indifference had finally been cut down to size. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, her face a mask of strained patience, the kind she always wore when she was trying to pretend things weren't as bad as they actually were. But the truth was written in every line on her face, in the way she clenched her fingers against her arms, in the way her gaze darted between me and my father, in the way she knew this moment was different. I took my time walking toward the table, my heels clicking against the floor, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable. And then, finally, he spoke. "We made a mistake, sweetheart," my father said, his voice lower, rougher, carrying an edge of something that almost sounded like sincerity, but wasn't quite there. I didn't sit down. I didn't say a word. I just watched him, waiting, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it, long enough for him to know that I wasn't going to make this easy for him. "We need your help," he continued, swallowing hard, forcing the words out like they physically hurt to say. I tilted my head slightly, feigning curiosity, feigning innocence, feigning the kind of daughterly concern that I knew he was expecting, the kind that he had always counted on. "Help," I echoed, letting the word roll off my tongue like it was foreign to me, like I had never heard it before, like I had never spent years giving him exactly that. He exhaled, shifting in his chair, looking at me with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't quite arrogance either, something that told me he was still holding on to the last scraps of pride he had left. "The house," he said, voice tight. "The mortgage is overdue. The utilities are going to be shut off. We just need a little help getting back on track, that's all." A little help. Back on track. Like I hadn't already spent years carrying them, years paying for their life, years bending over backward to make sure they never felt an ounce of the struggle I had felt every single day. I leaned against the back of the chair across from him, tapping my fingers lightly against the wood, letting my silence speak for me, watching as the tension in the room thickened. And then, as if on cue, my mother sighed and threw her hands up. "We're family, Natalie," she said, her voice taking on that familiar, condescending edge, the one she used whenever she wanted to remind me of my so-called obligations, the one she used whenever she thought she could guilt me into fixing everything for them. "We took care of you when you were younger, and now it's your turn to take care of us." I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I let out a slow, measured breath, tilting my head slightly, my gaze flickering between them. "Oh!" I mused, raising an eyebrow. "You took care of me?" My father's jaw clenched. My mother's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, as if she wanted to say something that would put me back in my place, but for the first time, there was no place for me to return to. Because I wasn't their safety net anymore. And then, just as the silence started to become unbearable, the front door creaked open and Jason walked in. I turned my head slightly, watching as my younger brother stepped inside, his gaze flickering between our parents and me, his expression unreadable, his hands shoved into the pockets of his expensive coat, the same coat my parents had probably bought for him, the same coat that had never been a necessity because he had never been forced to carry the weight of this family the way I had. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, looking at my father with forced sympathy, but I could see through it, could see the careful calculation behind his eyes, could see the way he was already preparing to deliver a final blow. "Look," he said, voice smooth, casual, unapologetic. "I get it, this sucks, but I can't help. I've got my own family to take care of." And there it was. The moment my father realized that the only child he had ever truly valued had never planned on saving him. I watched as something inside him cracked, as his shoulders slumped, as his face paled, as he finally understood that he had backed the wrong horse. And then, finally, I smiled. "I've got a little surprise for you, Dad," I said, my voice light, amused, dripping with the kind of satisfaction I had waited my entire life to feel. His eyes flickered to mine, confusion and panic dancing behind them, his hands tightening into fists, his entire body going rigid because he already knew, whatever was coming next, he wasn't going to like it. And God, I couldn't wait to see his face when he realized just how much he had lost. The house was packed, filled with the familiar noise of overlapping conversations, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of Christmas music playing from the speakers in the corner, the warmth of laughter that always seemed to come so easily to everyone except me. My extended family had gathered in my parents' home, the same home that had once belonged to me as well, the same home I had kept standing with my money, my effort, my silent sacrifices. It was supposed to be a celebration, a holiday get-together, a time for family to come together, share stories, pretend that nothing had changed, pretend that everything was still the way it used to be. But everything had changed. And by the time this night was over, there would be no more pretending. I sat quietly at the dinner table, the weight of the small envelope in my lap grounding me, my fingers lightly tracing its edges, my heart steady, my mind sharp, my pulse completely at ease. I had waited for this moment, planned it carefully, made sure that when the truth came out, there would be no room for my father to twist the story, no space for my mother to soften the edges, no way for anyone to make excuses for what had already been done. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the warmth of it spread through my chest as I glanced around the room, taking in the people who had spent years looking at me without ever really seeing me. My aunts and uncles laughed over their drinks, my cousins exchanged gifts, my brother Jason sat at the far end of the table, barely paying attention to anyone, too preoccupied with his phone to bother pretending he cared about being here. My mother stood near the kitchen, keeping up appearances, her forced smile a little too tight, her eyes darting toward me every few seconds, as if she could feel it, as if she could sense what was coming. And then there was my father. Richard Carter sat at the head of the table, his usual place, his usual role, still acting like the king of a kingdom that was already crumbling beneath him. He laughed at some joke my uncle made, took a sip of the whiskey in his hand, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he truly believed that things were back to normal, if he had really convinced himself that his desperate begging had worked, that I had forgiven and forgotten, that I had fallen back into line the way he had expected me to. Poor man. He had no idea. I straightened my back, set my wine glass down gently, and stood up, the movement slow, deliberate, intentional. The room quieted slightly, a few heads turning, a few conversations pausing as I held up the small envelope for everyone to see. "I want to make an announcement," I said, my voice carrying easily through the space, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention, it demanded it. More silence. More heads turning. All eyes on me now. I let the moment stretch, let the anticipation build, let them feel the weight of the pause, and then, with a quiet, steady breath, I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen twice, and held it up. A recording began to play, my father's voice crackling through the speaker, his words sharp, cutting, undeniable. "She's a failure. She'll never succeed, no matter how much money she makes." A few gasps, a few hushed murmurs. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. "I never even wanted her. She's a mistake that should have never happened." The room froze. Time stopped. And across the table, my father's face turned an unnatural shade of pale. He stared at me, wide-eyed, mouth slightly open, his entire body going still, his fingers tightening around his glass like he was holding onto the last shreds of his dignity. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, the kind that could not be explained away, could not be denied, could not be excused. I turned the recording off, let my phone drop to my side, and tilted my head slightly, letting my gaze lock onto my father's, letting him see the woman he had underestimated for far too long. "This," I said calmly, gesturing toward my phone, "is why I stopped paying your bills." The weight of my words settled over the room like a storm cloud, pressing down on everyone, filling the space with the cold, hard reality of what had been said, what had been done, what could never be taken back. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face twitching, his throat bobbing, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to piece together a response, tried to salvage what little reputation he had left. Natalie, I didn't," he started, his voice cracking, his usual confidence gone, his usual arrogance shattered. But I didn't care about his excuses. I didn't care about his regret. I didn't care about anything he had to say. So I simply picked up my wine glass, took one final sip, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the last image of him sitting there, his entire world collapsing around him, his carefully built lies crumbling into dust. And then, without another word, I walked away. Did Natalie go too far, or did she simply give her father the consequences he deserved? Would you have forgiven him?